Hello again, Dan Alasso, Making History, and today, as promised, I want to tell you what was in that very first issue of the first volume of the first series of the New Harmony Gazette. Now, this was a newspaper that was printed in New Harmony, Indiana, by the brand new New Harmony Society, which was led by Robert Owen. But the paper was probably edited, although they don't say in this one, by his son Robert Dale Owen and possibly by his other son William, and then probably also with contributions by Frances Wright, who becomes a partner of Robert Dale Owen when they move to New York and turn it into the Free Inquirer. So this one is published for the very first time on the 1st of October, 1825. And the masthead already carries the motto, "If we cannot reconcile all opinions, let us endeavor to unite all hearts." It's a 3-column, 8-page paper, and the first column, the left-hand column of page 1, includes a prospectus of the paper in which the editors reiterate the motto that is on that masthead again, and then go on to explain, "Be assured that men err not from an innate principle of vice, but from ignorance, and that the paper will try to find all of the areas where they can agree with other people. But where there are substantial differences, they say they will try to gently but firmly advocate for their views." One of the main issues that they plan on, quote, developing more fully is what they call the social system, by which they generally mean socialism. They say pretty clearly in explaining this, and they put this in all caps in the paper, that individuality detracts largely from the sum of human happiness. They promise, however, to avoid the type of ad hominem attacks that they describe as personality, because, again in capitals, no man forms his own character either mentally or physically. And this is kind of what we might call environmental determinism. And it's an interesting parallel of what Charles Knowlton says in his Elements of Modern Materialism, which he's probably working on at about this time. He doesn't publish it till 1828, 1829. It's also an interesting anticipation of postmodernism in a way. They also say that they favor freedom of speech because, and this is italicized, the expression of opinions, however erroneous, may become useful where reason and truth are left free to combat them. So they're not afraid of opinions that are not the same as their own, as long as those opinions don't carry the force of law. The Gazette's subscription price is going to be $2 annually, and it lists in the second column a bunch of sales agents in places like Vincennes, Indiana, Louisville, Kentucky, Cincinnati, Zanesville, Steubenville, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Boston, New York City, Trenton, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, New Orleans, Nashville, St. Louis, Shawneetown, and Mount Vernon, Indiana. So, right from the start, they have a pretty substantial network of other people, many of whom are probably printers and publishers themselves, some of whom may just be retail agents. And I will track those people down at some point and try to establish what this network may have been up to. Then the rest of the page and most of the second page is devoted to a transcript of a speech given by Robert Owen on Wednesday, April 27th, 1825, at the new Hall of New Harmony, describing the plan for the new society that Owen is launching and the constitution of what he's calling the preliminary society that would recruit and train new members for basically a communal system. And Owen begins his address by announcing, "I am come to this country to introduce an entire new state of society, to change it from the ignorant, selfish system to an enlightened social system, which shall gradually unite all interests into one and remove all cause for contest between individuals. The individual system he says, has heretofore universally prevailed. And while it continues, the great mass of mankind must remain, as they comparatively are at present, itinerant, poor, oppressed, and consequently vicious and miserable. Owen, as the editors had previously done, states that people are formed, quote, by the circumstances which are permitted to surround them from birth, and that no man has ever had any will or power or control in creating himself. Now, this, of course, goes against the myth of the self-made man and the kind of rags to riches story that other authors in the 19th century, such as Horatio Alger, are going to be pushing into the public consciousness. Because of this culturally determined human nature, people should not be blamed for their errors, Owen says. Rather, the real nature of man being thus laid open to us, the proceedings requisite to produce good instead of evil and happiness instead of misery, become obvious and easy to practice. Owens' plan for New Harmony, which at this point they are hyphenating because harmony already exists and this is New Harmony. The plan is that it would be, quote, the best halfway house I could procure for those who are going to travel this extraordinary journey with me. And although it is not intended to be our permanent residence, I hope it will be found not a bad traveler's tavern. The idea, he says, is that intermediate measures should be adopted to enable all parties with the least inconvenience to change their individual selfish habits and to acquire the superior habits requisite to a social state. But he warns that although the ultimate goal is complete equality, in order to procure the services of the technical experts that he thinks are going to be necessary to help get this society off the ground, he's going to need to pay those experts market rates for their services. And this, he warns, would create a, quote, certain degree of pecuniary inequality at first, although Owen seems to trust that this will be temporary. He then goes on to mention that he has spoken more than once already to the U.S. House of Representatives and has laid out the plan and the principles of his society to them. And then follows the actual constitution of this society, which is dated May 1st, 1825. And it specifies that this thing at New Harmony is actually a preliminary society, which is designed, again, to improve the character and condition of its own members and to prepare them to become associates in independent communities, having common property. He says that even in the preliminary society, all members would be, quote, of the same rank, no artificial inequality being acknowledged, precedence to be given only to age and experience. He does mention what he calls persons of color, whom he says may be received as helpers to the society if necessary, or if it be found useful, to prepare and enable them to become associates in communities in Africa, or in some other country, or in some other part of this country. So he's apparently open to black people becoming equal members in cooperative societies, but he doesn't seem ready to welcome them into New Harmony or the society that it is preparing its members to create on quite an equal footing with whites. Like many of his contemporaries, Owen seems to prefer resettlement to assimilation. Owen then refers to a set of rules and regulations that he has published in a pamphlet called Mr. Owens' Plan for the Permanent Relief of the Working Classes. And he elaborates on these rules over the entire third page of the paper. He lays out plans for educating children, says that all members will enjoy complete liberty of conscience, and he mentions that persons who possess capital and who do not wish to be employed can buy into the society with their money rather than with their labor. While this does seem to be a useful way to raise funds, it's unclear to me exactly how a membership divided between those who worked and those who brought their cash in with them would actually function. Owen further states that as much as possible, the society ought to buy American produce. and that although he would like to ban alcohol, he doesn't really think that the time is right for that. And I should say that some of Owen's optimism about this society seems to be based on the strength and success of the original Rappite Harmony community. And he mentions this when he concludes, saying, "It is due to the society who formed and until now occupied this settlement to state that I have not yet met with more kind-hearted, temperate, and industrious citizens, nor found men more sincere, upright, and honest in all their dealings than the Harmonians." He doesn't address the question of whether their success as a cooperative society depended at all on their shared religious orientation, which I think is a serious question. Following this 2.5-page description of Robert Owen's project, pages 4 and 5 are devoted to Frances Wright's project, what she calls a plan for the gradual abolition of slavery in the United States, without danger of loss to the citizens of the South. A short introduction before the actual text of the plan describes this as a pamphlet recently published in Baltimore. The editor describes chattel slavery as, quote, "a national misfortune, so pregnant with mischief, and a misfortune which will, if not speedily averted, carry its dreadful consequences throughout our country." The editor then hopefully suggests that the intelligent and liberal planters of the South are now ripe for encouraging the enterprise. And then moving on to the actual pamphlet, Wright introduces her plan as a way to meet what she calls at once the pecuniary interests and the prevailing opinions of the Southern planters, which are basically that they expect to be paid for freed slaves, and they expect the freed people to then be removed for colonization somewhere else. Wright believes that her plan can achieve these two goals by taking advantage of what she calls the great advantages of united over individual labor. And that's exactly the cooperative synergy that Owen is hoping to unleash in his so-called social system. She says that freed slaves could be sent either to Haiti or to the Mexican territory of Texas. And the benefits of this would be to eliminate, quote, "the internal slave trade, which now paralyzes the industry and disgraces the character of Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky, and also of opening the South to white labor." She even suggests that if they aren't going to be relocated to a foreign country, the freed slaves might be sent to, quote, "a fine region beyond the Rocky Mountains, within the jurisdiction of the United States." And this is not entirely unlike Thomas Jefferson's hope that the Indian problem might be solved by simply moving the natives to what at the time seems an endless west. Wright had recently visited Monticello with Lafayette and may have discussed the issue with the former president. Wright proposes in this document to buy 2 sections of land, or 1,280 acres, farm implements, livestock, and 100 slaves for a total of $41,168. She projects annual cotton production of 1,000 pounds for each enslaved person, which she says is about 200 pounds less than the average quota that's expected per slave by Southern planters. At 12.5 cents per pound, she says the community would then produce $12,500 in revenue annually, and after deducting for interest at 6%, Wright projects an annual profit of nearly $10,000. At this rate, she says that the slaves engaged in the project, quote, "will repay the purchase money with interest in less than 4 years." Wright then shows a chart claiming that by doubling the number of slaves involved in the project every 5 years, the entire slave population of the United States could be redeemed in about 80 years. If the plan began with 800 slaves instead of 100, she claims the job could be completed in 65 years. Wright does not suggest that this is the plan that should be adopted, but she says that this is an illustration of, quote, "the general redeeming power of labor, if all its earnings be preserved and applied to one purpose." The problem with this plan, of course, is that the earnings of slave labor are already being applied to one purpose, the enrichment of the planters. Frances Wright has taken the men she has met, especially people like Jefferson and Madison and Monroe and Andrew Jackson, at their words when they told her that they were concerned about slavery and sincerely wanted to find a solution to this problem. As historians writing recently have pointed out, Frances Wright's idealistic attitude toward the U.S. is soon replaced by a tone of a little bit of disappointment and sometimes a bit of cynicism. And I'll talk more about that in the future. The 6th page of the Gazette is devoted to a background sketch of Robert Owen and what they call a view of New Harmony that includes a little bit about the community's history. Owen is mentioned as having just left New York to visit his family at New Lanark, Scotland, and is described as a 54-year-old who made his fortune at the Charlton Mills of Manchester before he and his partners bought the mill at New Lanark, which he then operated for about 25 years. Convinced of what we might, again, call environmental determinism, Owen devoted himself to, quote, studying the human character and devising and perfecting plans for removing the evils which surround man from his birth. Arriving in America in November 1824, Owen bought the town of Harmony and the adjoining lands with the plan of putting this idea into practice. The original Harmonists had been a German Lutheran sect that had emigrated to America in 1804 under the leadership of George Rapp and had built a successful communistic community. The article admits, it does not appear that this association was formed from a rational conviction of the many advantages arising from cooperative industry, but from some religious sanction. Although the writer of this seems to believe that this fact would tend to decrease rather than increase their chances of success. And I'm not so sure I agree. In any case, the Rappites first settled in Pennsylvania in 1804 and then moved to Indiana in 1814. After 10 years, their community, quote, consisted of more than 30,000 acres of valuable land, together with improvements, stock, and personal effects, amounting to the estimated value of $1 million. The members, the author claims, arrived with property worth about $25 per head, and in 1825, a fair estimate gave them $2,500 each. The implication seems to be that what the religious Rappites were able to do in 10 years, the social system ought to at least be able to equal. Page 7 and 8 are devoted to news and correspondence. In the column called the Domestic Summary, it's noted that a cooperating society had been established in Pittsburgh on Owenite principles, headed by Benjamin Bakewell and John Snyder, who I will look up and see if I can find anything about. Another notice states that General Lafayette was in Washington City on the 30th of August, having returned from a farewell visit to the 3 ex-presidents in Virginia. That would be Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And this is the visit that Frances Wright accompanied him on. In the Foreign Summary, a comment critical of Britain is made regarding what's called the desperate struggle on the part of the natives of Burma to retain the sovereignty of their country. The paper's final page, page 8, includes a couple of poems, a description of the Quran of Muhammad, and several jokes, including one which I'll quote, in which David Hume, to induce a young lady who was very fond of reading novels to read history, told her that there was no great difference between them in the point of falsehood, one being in general almost as true as the other. So on that slightly humorous note about the historical project that I'm working on, I'll end my description of the first issue of the New Harmony Gazette. I'll be back with more as I read additional issues, but in the meantime, I hope people found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for listening. I will see you again very soon.